a neat vertical column of magma rising like a chimney straight up from deep in the earth directly beneath Yellowstone. Clean, simple, wrong. A peer-reviewed paper just dropped in Science, one of the most prestigious journals in existence, and it quietly dismantled that diagram entirely. The magma isn't rising vertically, it's coming in sideways, through a tilted underground corridor connected to the same tectonic forces tearing the West Coast apart. And here's the part nobody's talking about. The researchers say an eruption has less to do with how much magma is down there, and everything to do with whether the crust above can break. Stay with me, you're going to want to see this. Before we begin, if you genuinely enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss a single update as this story develops. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from, what time it is there, and tell me this. A peer-reviewed study just quietly rewrote the entire structural map of the most watched supervolcano on Earth. And it turns out the real trigger for an eruption has nothing to do with heat or pressure, but with whether the ground above can simply crack open. So does it mean that we built 40 years of monitoring around the wrong model? What else did we get wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Now, let us get into it. Part 1. The paper that quietly changed Yellowstone. Something happened in April of 2026 that almost nobody noticed. A peer-reviewed paper landed in Science, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on the planet, and it quietly, methodically dismantled something that geologists have been teaching for more than 40 years. No press conference, no emergency announcement from the USGS, no breathless CNN Chiron, just a study, published in the calm, sterile language of academic science, that essentially said, we had Yellowstone wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. Wrong in the way that means every hazard model, every textbook diagram, every visualization you have ever seen of magma rising in a straight column beneath that famous caldera in Wyoming, all of it needs to be reconsidered. Now, before anyone reaches for their emergency kit, let me be clear about something. This discovery does not mean Yellowstone is about to erupt. The USGS has not changed its assessment. The volcano remains what it has been for years in terms of official risk classification, a system being monitored, a system being studied, a system that is not showing signs of imminent catastrophe. But here is the thing about science that people sometimes forget. The absence of imminent danger is not the same as a complete understanding of the system. And what this paper reveals is that our understanding of the system, the actual architecture of what sits beneath your feet in Wyoming, was built on a model that new data simply does not support. The paper comes from a team at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, led by a researcher named Cao and colleagues, and what they built is genuinely impressive. They constructed a full three-dimensional geodynamic simulation of the western United States, a computational model that integrates seismic tomography data, magnetotelluric conductivity measurements, and mantle flow modeling into a single coherent picture of what the rock and partial melt and moving asthenosphere actually look like beneath the surface. Not a sketch, not an approximation. A multi-dataset reconstruction that cross-references independent lines of evidence to produce what may be the most complete picture of the Yellowstone magmatic system ever assembled. And what that picture shows is not what anyone expected, or rather it is not what the dominant model predicted. The magma feeding Yellowstone is not rising in a neat vertical column from some enormous pool of heat in the lower mantle. It is being transported through a tilted conduit, a southwest dipping pathway, a structure that angles obliquely through the lithosphere and connects Yellowstone not to some isolated thermal anomaly sitting directly below it, but to the same regional tectonic machinery that is actively pulling the western United States apart. The system is not a chimney. It is something far stranger, and in some ways, far more interesting. Think about what a chimney implies. Heat rises, magma accumulates at depth, buoyancy drives it upward, pressure builds, and eventually the system either erupts or it doesn't. That is the intuitive model. That is the model that fits naturally into how people imagine volcanoes, because it matches the basic physics of hot things rising through cold things. The plume model, the idea that Yellowstone sits above a mantle plume, a column of anomalously hot material rising from the deep mantle, has been the organising framework for Yellowstone geology since the 1980s. It explains the hotspot track across Idaho. It explains the succession of caldera-forming eruptions moving northeast across the continent over millions of years. It feels complete. It feels like it works. Except the simulation does not reproduce it. The three-dimensional reconstruction of the mantle and lithosphere beneath western North America shows a system that is not vertically organized. The melt originates in the upper asthenosphere, not in a deep plume source. The transport pathway is not a rising column, it is a tilted corridor, shaped not by buoyancy alone, but by the stress geometry of the surrounding lithosphere. And crucially, it is not isolated. It connects outward. It extends into the broader tectonic deformation zone of the western United States. The model integrates multiple independent datasets, seismic tomography from different research groups, magnetotelluric surveys that image electrical conductivity as a proxy for melt fraction, and dynamic flow simulations, and all of them independently reproduce the same oblique southwest dipping geometry. That convergence matters enormously. When one dataset shows you something unexpected, the natural response is skepticism. Maybe it is a processing artifact. Maybe the resolution is insufficient. Maybe there is a contaminating signal from something nearby. But when multiple independent methods based on completely different physical principles, all point to the same geometry, the probability that you're looking at an artifact drops significantly. The tilted structure is not a quirk of the data. It appears to be real, and this single finding forces a reinterpretation of almost everything else. If Yellowstone is not fed by a vertical plume, then its location is not determined by where the hotspot source sits beneath it. Its location is determined by tectonic geometry, by the arrangement of stress fields and lithospheric thickness and crustal weakness that happens to funnel magma toward that particular patch of Wyoming. Yellowstone is not sitting above a heat source. It is sitting at an intersection point, a structural junction where the geometry of the continent happens to allow melt to reach the surface. That is a completely different kind of statement about what Yellowstone is, and it has implications that we will spend the rest of this video working through. Because here is where the central question lives. If the system is tilted, if it is laterally connected, if magma is not pooling in a pressurized chamber, but moving through a distributed network shaped by tectonic forces, then what actually controls whether Yellowstone erupts? What is the variable that matters? And the answer this paper proposes is not the one most people would guess. It is not the temperature. It is not the volume of magma. It is not even the rate at which new melt is being produced. The answer, according to this model, is whether the crust above can break. The eruption question in the new framework is a mechanical question about crustal failure, and that changes everything about how we should be thinking about this system. But to understand why that reframing is so significant, you first need to understand what was found, or rather, what was conspicuously not found when scientists spent decades trying to image what sits beneath Yellowstone. And that is where the story gets genuinely strange. Part 2: The Missing Deep Chamber That Never Showed Up. For as long as Yellowstone has been studied as a volcanic system, the assumption sitting underneath all the science was this: somewhere down there is a chamber, a reservoir, a pool of molten rock under enough pressure that given the right conditions, it could find a way to the surface. This is how volcanoes work in the public imagination, and for most classical volcanic systems, it is a reasonable approximation of reality. You have a heat source, you have a zone of molten material, you have a pathway, and when the system exceeds some critical threshold, you get an eruption. Clean, causal, sequential. The problem with Yellowstone is that nobody ever found the chamber. Decades of seismic imaging, surveys that use earthquake waves and artificial vibrations to scan the interior of the crust, the way a medical ultrasound scans a body, should have revealed a large coherent body of liquid magma somewhere beneath the caldera if one existed. When seismic waves pass through partially molten rock, they slow down. When they hit a zone of true liquid melt, the effect is dramatic. Certain wave types cannot pass through liquid at all. If there were a classic magma reservoir beneath Yellowstone, it would show up in the data as a pronounced, spatially coherent anomaly. Researchers looked. They have been looking for a long time. What they found was more complicated and harder to explain away. What the seismic data consistently shows is not a single coherent chamber. It shows two distinct zones of anomalous material at different depths, neither of which looks like a pressurized reservoir of liquid magma. The shallower zone sits between roughly 5 and 17 kilometers below the surface. It is the one that has received the most attention. This is the rhyolitic magma mush zone, the material most directly associated with the surface volcanic features visible at Yellowstone. But even this zone is not what people picture when they think of a magma reservoir. The melt fraction, the proportion of the rock that is actually liquid, is estimated to be somewhere between 5 and 15%, depending on the method used and the region of the caldera examined. The rest of the material is crystalline, solid, behaving more like a sponge saturated with partial melt than a pressurized tank of liquid rock. The second zone is the one that drew less public attention but may be more important for understanding the system. It sits between roughly 20 and 50 kilometers depth and consists of basaltic partial melt, a different composition from the shallow rhyolitic zone, denser and derived from a different part of the crustal and upper mantle column. Magnetotelluric surveys, which image the electrical conductivity of underground rock and are sensitive to the presence of conductive fluids including partial melt, have been particularly important in revealing this zone because seismic methods alone do not fully capture its geometry. The two methods together, seismic wave velocity anomalies and electrical conductivity patterns, converge on a picture of distributed partial melt spread across multiple zones rather than pooled in a single reservoir. For a long time, the response to this finding within the scientific community was essentially, the technology is not good enough yet. The assumption was that the chamber was there, it had to be there, the model required it, but the resolution of available imaging methods was insufficient to reveal it clearly. This is not an unreasonable position. Seismic tomography at crustal scales does have real resolution limitations, and there is genuine scientific literature discussing what level of melt fraction is required before a coherent body becomes detectable. The absence of evidence was treated as evidence of a limitation, not evidence of absence. What the new model from Cow and colleagues does is reframe that absence entirely. In the distributed transport framework, the absence of a coherent deep chamber is not a gap in the data, it is a predicted outcome. If Yellowstone is fed by a tilted network that delivers melt from the upper asthenosphere through an oblique pathway shaped by tectonic stress, then you would not expect to find a single pooled reservoir sitting directly below the caldera in a neat vertical column. You would expect to find exactly what the data shows, distributed partial melt in multiple zones, spread across a range of depths, with no clear single source body. The data that was previously treated as puzzling or incomplete now matches the model's predictions almost exactly. This is a significant shift in how scientists interpret what they are seeing. The system behaves less like a pressure cooker, fill it up, heat it up, wait for the valve to fail, and more like a saturated sponge rock matrix, with melt moving through it in response to stress gradients rather than buoyancy alone. The old metaphor fails. The new one is stranger and harder to visualize, but it fits the observations. And critically, this distributed architecture has direct implications for eruption potential, implications that are counterintuitively somewhat reassuring but also entirely different from the reassurances that were offered before, because a distributed system is not the same as a dangerous system. A system where melt is dispersed across multiple zones, where no single zone has a high melt fraction, where pressure cannot easily accumulate in one place, because the fluid pathways are too diffuse. That kind of system is harder to destabilize than a classic pressurized reservoir. The very structure that seemed alarming because it defied the familiar model may actually represent a more mechanically stable configuration than a single large chamber would be. The catch is that stability in a distributed system is not controlled by the same variables as stability in a classical reservoir. And that is exactly what the community is still working to understand. What this means for the people watching those famous geysers and hot springs and mud pots at Yellowstone, those beautiful and slightly unnerving surface expressions of what lies below, we're going to come back to. But first, let us talk about how the scientific community received this paper, because the reaction was not what you might expect from a finding this significant. Part 3. The first silent shock in the geology community. When a paper this consequential lands in science, you might expect the response to be immediate and loud. Press releases, counter papers, someone on social media declaring the end of the plume paradigm. That is how science is sometimes portrayed, as a series of dramatic confrontations between old ideas and new data, played out in real time for the public audience. The reality, as usual, is quieter and stranger. The paper moved through the geoscience community in the way that genuinely challenging work tends to move, not with a bang, but with the slow, uncertain energy of a claim that people are not sure what to do with yet. Some researchers engage with it quickly, recognizing the significance of the multi-data set approach and the robustness of the convergence across independent methods. Others responded with the kind of cautious skepticism that is professionally appropriate and personally natural when someone tells you that a model you've been teaching for 4 decades needs to be reconsidered. The community is currently divided, and that is worth being honest about. On one side, you have researchers who have invested significant careers in the plume model, geophysicists who have built sophisticated computational frameworks for mantle plumes, volcanologists who have interpreted the Yellowstone hotspot track using plume dynamics as the organizing principle, educators who have written textbook chapters and designed curriculum around the idea of a vertical heat source beneath the Snake River plain. For these researchers, the new model is not just a technical claim about conduit geometry. It is a challenge to an interpretive framework that has proven useful and productive for a long time. It generates specific, testable predictions. It has explanatory power. Abandoning it requires not just accepting new data, but accepting that the new data is better than the existing interpretive architecture. And that is not a concession anyone makes easily. On the other side, you have a growing community of researchers who have been uncomfortable with the plume model for some time. Seismic tomographers who know perfectly well that the resolution of current imaging beneath Yellowstone is insufficient to detect a classical deep mantle plume, and have been cautious about asserting one confidently. Geodynamicists who have modelled the interaction between the Farallon slab remnants, the basin and range extension, and the Walker Lane shear zone, and who have suspected for years that the magmatic system of the western United States is more interconnected than the isolated hotspot model implies. For these researchers, the new paper does not feel like a disruption. It feels like a confirmation of doubts they have been carrying quietly. The technical debate at the centre of this divide is not trivial, and it is worth stating clearly. One of the principal objections raised by plume advocates is that seismic tomography at the depths involved has genuine resolution limitations, and that the apparent tilted geometry of the conduit might reflect imaging artifacts rather than true structural geometry. Specifically, the presence of subducted slab material, remnants of the old Farallon Plate, now sinking through the mantle at various depths and orientations beneath western North America, creates complex velocity perturbations that can, in principle, distort the apparent geometry of other structures nearby. If you are imaging through or near a slab, the slab's velocity signature can bleed into neighbouring features and create apparent tilts or offsets that do not reflect the true structure. The COW team's response to this is methodological rather than dismissive. By integrating the magnetotelluric data, which is sensitive to electrical conductivity rather than seismic velocity, and is therefore not subject to the same artifact mechanisms, they argue that the tilted geometry appears consistently across methods that are not subject to the same potential biases. An imaging artifact that appears in seismic tomography should not simultaneously appear in magnetotelluric conductivity maps, because the two techniques are measuring fundamentally different physical properties of the rock. The fact that both methods reproduce the same oblique structure is a significant argument against the artifact interpretation. What this debate reveals is something important about the nature of scientific paradigm shifts. The plume model has been not just a scientific hypothesis, but an organizing framework, a lens through which data was interpreted, a template against which new findings were measured. When your framework becomes a template, it starts to shape what you see, subtly and often unconsciously. Anomalies get rationalized. Limitations get attributed to technology rather than to the model. And the longer the framework has been in place, the harder it is to see around it. Because the infrastructure of interpretation, the textbooks, the course syllabi, the established methods for processing and presenting data has all been built to work within it. This is not a criticism of the scientists involved. It is a description of how science actually works, at the human level, when confronted with findings that challenge foundational assumptions. The plume model has 40 years of institutional weight behind it. The new model has a high-impact paper, a multi-data set convergence argument, and a growing body of independent work on Western US mantle dynamics that points in the same direction. What it does not yet have is consensus. And consensus in geophysics, as in all sciences, takes time. But here is what makes this particular debate unusually significant, and what makes it more than just an internal argument among mantle physicists. The debate is not only about Yellowstone, it is about the fundamental mechanics of how melt is generated and transported in the upper mantle beneath continental plates. It is about whether intraplate volcanism that occurs far from plate boundaries, in the interiors of large continental plates, is primarily driven by thermal anomalies rising from depth, or by tectonic stress configurations at the lithospheric scale. If the distributed flow model is correct for Yellowstone, then similar reinterpretations may be warranted for other intraplate volcanic systems around the world. Yellowstone becomes a test case for a much larger argument about planetary dynamics. And the new model's answer to that larger argument is this: